Good morning. It's Tuesday, April 7th, and apparently it's a very pink day. A few things to go over before we get to today's lesson. This has to do with the nature of the class. First of all, quiz 21. We take a quiz for every chapter that we complete. So the quiz over chapter 21 will be due by Wednesday, April 15th. So I'm giving you plenty of lead time for this. Quiz 21 due Wednesday, April 15th. Single question. The question is, how did Russia become communist? So it's fairly broad. You can tell me any number of things. You can describe the historical events. You could tell me the reasons why this happened. Whatever you want to do with it. There's many right answers to this. But how did Russia become communist? At least 100 words long. So I've reduced the number of necessary words to help you guys out. I understand there's going to be a lot of writing. And I know that you're doing other things. So at least 100 words long. It can be submitted by email or by packet because the packets will be due that day as well. So Wednesday, April 15th, quiz 21. I'm also giving you a heads up because test number 7 is going to be due on Wednesday, April 15th as well. And by the way, did I just say April 21st? If I did, forgive me. April 15th. April 15th for quiz 21, April 15th for test 7 as well. So test number 7. There's a little bit of difference here. I've got a new plan in place. It is either 5 or 10 questions, depending upon homework. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Each answer for test number 7 must be at least 75 words long. If your homework is completed, you may choose any 5 questions. So here's the way it is. Homework is now optional. If you do your homework, you only have to do 5 questions on the test. If you don't do your homework, you must do all 10 questions. So you may choose how best to spend your time. If you've already done your homework, then congratulations, you have a 5-question test to look forward to. If you have not, and you may determine, I don't want to do my homework, it's fine. Now you just have to do all 10 questions, but I'll leave that up to you. So either 5 or 10 questions, depending on if you're submitting it with the homework. If homework is incomplete, you must do all 10 questions. So what are the questions for test number 7? Well, I will post them on an email you'll receive, so you'll have them written out, but just to review, it's what was the Boxer Rebellion? What happened in the Russo-Japanese War? What was the Bismarck system? What was the Schlieffen Plan? What weapons were developed during World War I? Where did that go? What drew America into World War I? What happened at the Paris Peace Conference? What were some causes of the Great Depression? How did Mussolini take power in Italy? And how did Hitler take power in Germany? So those are the 10 questions. Now, concerning the homework, that's also due on the 15th. If you don't do it, that's fine. Just do all 10 questions for the test. If you do it, make sure it's submitted with the packet. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I will post this online so you can see it consistently. You don't have to just write them down right now. All right, today's lesson. We were discussing yesterday about Russia and the transition that Russia made in the interwar period. So Russia destroys the Tsarist system and then transitions into communism. Lenin becomes the leader of Russia. He leads the Bolsheviks to victory over the Mensheviks. The Red Army beats the White Army. Lenin has a heart attack. Lenin dies in 1924. So it's still fairly early in the transition from old Russia into new Russia. As soon as Lenin dies, this launches a power struggle as to see who is going to be in control of Russia at that time. Now, admittedly, it wasn't just about who's going to be in control. Keep in mind, these were the communists. They had already murdered probably 4 to 6 million already by this point. And so everyone knew if you competed for leadership and if you lost, it wasn't just a loss. You were going to be tortured to death. You needed to win. The 2 primary men were Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. Now, there were a number of other men who wanted to compete for power. They didn't have enough people in support of them. And gradually, not even gradually, relatively quickly, all the major communists fall into one of 2 camps, either Trotsky or Stalin. Now, this gives you an idea of the men in the middle here. This is Lenin, Vladimir Lenin. This is Joseph Stalin, and this is Leon Trotsky. These men had all had a history within communism. Lenin had been exiled from the country. Stalin had been in the country Trotsky had also been in the country. They had all been fighting for communism in Russia for quite some time, all doing different things. Trotsky was the brains. Trotsky was actually a very gifted man. He was an army organizer, a capable general, a reader, a thinker. Lenin was the leader. He was the motivation. Stalin was brutality. He brought rage and death to the table, and those were useful skills within communism. So that's not I mean, in a very real way, he was very necessary. It was during these early years. We'll talk more about this in a bit. Stalin used his gift for death as a tool for the communists as they tried to establish terror. Trotsky was more intelligent. He had done more work for the party. Stalin had street smarts. Stalin had quietly, during the final years of Lenin, in fact, during the last years of Lenin, the last year, the only one who really related the decisions of the party with Lenin himself was Stalin. So Stalin kind of controlled all access to Lenin. Stalin had quietly installed a number of sycophants. Those are people who yes men, people who will do whatever you say in key positions. One by one, Stalin removed all others with any power outside of his own, and he had them executed. So Stalin had spent years as essentially a gangster. He had written poetry, he had written speeches, but they weren't particularly memorable. Stalin's life, he was actually born in the Republic of Georgia. He wasn't a native Russian. For a while, he'd gone to seminary to train to be a priest. He just was a cruel man, became disillusioned there, became an atheist, was kicked out of the seminary. Eventually, he believes in communism. He starts doing things like robbing banks and kidnapping and killing for the Communist Party. They needed money from somewhere, and robbing banks was as good as anywhere else. Stalin had been in and out of prison a few times. He had been remarkably effective in doing dirty work for the party. And so when the time came and there was a transition of power, Stalin may not have had the respect that Trotsky had. He may have not had the knowledge and the ability to overwhelm people with arguments. But Stalin knew how to hire murderers and thugs, and he did, and he was among them. And so he had everyone that was against him, or even not with him. It wasn't just a matter of being against Stalin. You had to be for him. And even that eventually wouldn't be enough. But he had them removed and then usually killed. This included his longtime friends and all what were called the old Bolsheviks, those who had been communists before the October Revolution of 1917. In 1927, Stalin had grown so powerful that he was finally able to have Trotsky completely removed from any position of power within the Soviet Union. He had one by one demoted or destroyed all those who did not owe their power to him alone. And so by that, what I mean is, in 1927, everyone had been chosen for their position by Stalin himself. And if he chose you, he could remove you, and everyone was aware of that. And so by 1927, everyone competed to do one thing, and that was to stay in Stalin's good graces, to please Joseph Stalin. And by the way, Stalin wasn't his real name. Stalin literally meant man of steel. That was what he wanted to communicate. His name was actually an ethnic Georgian name, but it wasn't nearly as inspiring, and most of the communists took pen names to kind of inspire, I guess. Trotsky at this point fled the country, kind of a mark of who Stalin was and how he operated, even though Stalin was hiding in Mexico. And by 1940, he had been on the run for 13 years. Stalin still sent agents to find him down, to hunt him, and to kill him. He was brutally murdered. By that time, almost all of Trotsky's children and most of his extended family had also been murdered. Stalin didn't just kill you, he killed everyone who ever knew you and everyone you ever cared about. Stalin was one of the most evil and destructive men of the 20th century. He's a product and a creator of communism. By 1928, Stalin was an absolute dictator. He ended the NEP. That was the new economic plan that Lenin had started. It had been moderately successful, but it had been I say moderately, very, very minorly successful. It was more successful than communism, we'll put it that way. And it had been more successful in communism because at the heart of Lenin's NEP plan was a little tiny bit of capitalism. That was the only thing that kept starvation at bay. So long as Lenin allowed some of the peasants the freedom to make their own grain and to sell it for their own good, That was the only way that Russia had anywhere near the amount of food, and they were still chronically behind in spite of all that. So Stalin in 28, he ends the NEP and he starts a series of what were called 5-year plans. And so essentially it was just one after another during Stalin's reign, and then even beyond, 5-year plans of how the Soviet government was going to control the economy for good. He believed that this would fix the chronic economic problems that were occurring in the USSR. Um, so this accelerated the push to full socialism called collectivization. Because by 1928, the majority of peasants were still working sometimes their own land or maybe a conglomeration of land. What Stalin wanted is he wanted all property, all capital owned by the state, by the people. It was socialism. Socialism and communism. They're essentially they're so similar as to it doesn't need to be separated here. Stalin and the economic plan was for all property to be collectivized, meaning all the peasants would no longer work their own property. They'd be gathered together and work these massive state-owned properties. As you can guess, it was a total failure. People are not motivated to work in such ways, and there's no hope of reward. Why work hard when you will not reap any bounty from that hard work? Rather, you just do the minimal you need to do in order not to die. So the Stalin's plans were absolute failures. They led to even more famine, more starvation, and so the result was Stalin needed a scapegoat. He couldn't admit that he had failed. Stalin blamed a group called the kulaks. The kulaks were peasants who were growing enough grain for their family and then enough to grow on the side. They were often called like wealthy peasants. They were not wealthy. A kulak was still well below the living standard of most of America. But comparatively speaking to most of the Russians who at this point were starving to death, they were doing really well because they could at least feed themselves. So Stalin did the unbelievably evil but also stupid thing. He had them executed. Stalin rounded up millions of the most prosperous, most successful, and most skilled farmers in a nation dying of famine, and he killed them. And you can imagine what the result is. The famine intensified. In Ukraine, they responded with less grain production. So he starved them. This is called the Holodomor. Stalin killed around 10 million of his own people, Ukrainians particularly, by this time. 10 million. These were numbers that had never been conceived before. Lenin, 4 million or just 6 million, whatever his number was just tremendous. But Stalin is blowing through that. Now, some of these are murders. A lot of these are somewhat murders. It's collective starvation, and that's what Stalin is doing. The communists would roll into a peasant's village or a homestead, and they would confiscate everything, and they would shoot. Often they would take the kulak, the father, into the town square and have him tortured and killed in front of everyone to send a message. And the message was received, and the result was nobody grew anything, and the famine grew much worse. Many Americans were actually excited for the communist experiment, and by Americans I mean primarily liberal Americans, leftists. One liberal reporter visited the Soviet Union and said, "I have seen the future and it works." Rumors of murder on a huge scale, they were known by the upper classes. All the intelligentsia knew what was happening, and they decided not to talk about it. The New York Times, the American paper of record that it calls itself, they sent their star reporter, Walter Durante, to visit the Ukraine and to report. He knew the truth. He knew about the death. He knew about the destruction. He knew about the murder. He knew about the genocide, and he lied. His articles praised Stalin and praised communism. He won a Pulitzer Prize for it. Everything he wrote for the New York Times, everything that the American public read from the New York Times was an absolute lie. The idea that fake news is something new is not true. Fake news has existed in time immemorial. It's just people are evil, and that includes journalists as well. They're not special. They're not uniquely blessed with ethics just because they write. They have perspectives, and they often lie in favor of those perspectives. It's the best thing you could do is, this is just a commercial, it's find, everyone has a viewpoint, everyone has a perspective, an ideology. That's not a wrong thing. But find people who are honest about it. Find people who will say, this is what I believe, and this is what I saw, and this is how I interpret it. That's more trustworthy. Millions continued to be tortured to death during the reign of Stalin. American liberals ignored the deaths and tried to bring his policies to the United States. It was actually a real push to see communism and socialism and fascism and other isms brought to the United States and to replace the American Constitution. By the mid-1930s, Stalin's five-year plans had been an undeniable failure. Famine was widespread. Industry was decades behind the West. But he was no longer in danger of losing power. By that time, Stalin had killed everyone who could even remotely challenge him. He murdered anyone who had competence and gained a good reputation, including friends. If a mayor of a city proved himself to be a capable administrator, that was a quick way to die. If you were good, you died. Stalin was notoriously paranoid. He launched a series of purges. Together, they were called the Great Purge. It's a nice way of saying that he murdered even more people. Another 1 to 1.2 million people were murdered during this time. This included many army officers. He briefly thought that maybe the army was plotting against him, which was not true. It didn't matter. He wanted to kill them anyway. So many generals, especially those of the highest ranks, members of the high command, were all executed. The lucky ones were sent to Siberia, where they labored in gulags. The gulags were these prison camps that were set up. There was probably more than 1 million people living in prison camps in the Soviet Union. This supposed haven for the common people, for the proletariat, and nobody killed more of them than the communists did. This is Stalin, and including a couple of his assistants. Incidentally, is this... Yes, I can't remember how to pronounce his name. This was one of his primary executors. Later, Stalin will have him executed. And then this painting, you'll notice it looks a little strange. In places, it looks actually like a painting. So you'll notice the water here, it doesn't look like it's mirror image like a photograph should be. That's because originally there was somebody standing here, and that person was executed, and Stalin had them airbrushed out. So as Stalin executed people, he airbrushed them. Later versions of this particular photo don't include this guy, because he was executed and airbrushed out as well. Stalin was determined to spread communism, not just throughout Russia, but throughout the world. So he started financing revolutions. He founded what was called the Comintern, which was supposedly a union of communist parties from around the world. You know, the Communist Party of France, the Communist Party of the United States, the Communist Party of Great Britain. Actually, it was just a way for Stalin to run other countries or to interfere with their own ways of doing things. He was not against murdering other communist leaders. The truth is, nobody killed more communists than other communists. No one in history has been responsible for the death of more communists than other communists. So just because the communists killed the Nazis doesn't mean that they're different. It's they're evil. We live in this weird time where people say, well, as long as they're fighting the Nazis, they must be... No, communists are evil, Nazis are evil, they're all evil. The solution to one evil is not to be the opposite evil. The solution to all evils is to be the good guy. So, you know, living in this world of Antifa and all these neo-Nazis, the way to oppose a neo-Nazi is not to be a communist. The way to oppose a neo-Nazi is to be an American. That's always been the way. So don't go into either ditch. It's just absolute stupidity. But this is the status of the Soviet Union. So entering into 1940, the Soviet Union is an economic mess. It's a military mess. It is a political mess. It is just straight evil, and tens of millions have died. So we'll continue tomorrow discussing the rise of fascism, particularly in both Italy and then Germany.